Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Rainville, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. I'm chairing today because Councilmember Andrew is out on parental leave, so wish him the best with his new child. And with me at the dais are Council Members Elliot Payne, Robin Wamsley, Jason Chavez, Lene Palmisano, Aisha Chuktai, Emily Koski. God, I'm having a bad day here. Yeah, thank you. Councilmember Ellison, Jamal, Lisa Goodman, and my dear friend from the 4th Ward. God, I'm sorry. Latricia Vita. I am so nervous. Thank you for bearing with me. I apologize for not remembering your names. So let the record reflect that we have a quorum, and today we have 3 items on the agenda, including our regular legislative update. So first we have a consent item, and we will dispense with that consent item with the passage of a resolution expressing unity with the people of Ukraine. Is there any discussion on this item? I would like to offer here, see no discussion. I'd like to move forward with the vote, but I would like to let our council members know that I did have a nice conversation with our Immigration and Refugee Affairs Director, and our city has welcomed 400 Afghan refugees, and 150 of them are children in our school system. Soon, this Ukrainian crisis, we will also see they expect a very large immigration. In my ward is a lot of my friends and neighbors from the Ukraine and descendants of refugees from the Ukraine. So it's very important that this resolution is passed, and I will be asking Ors Kramarchik, who is a leader in the Ukrainian community, to come and accept this resolution at our council meeting. So all those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Thank you very much. The next agenda item is item 2 on our agenda is a presentation regarding the 2022 state legislative session. I'll now invite Intergovernmental Relations Director Fatima Moore to begin the presentation. Fatima, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Oh, there we go. Good morning, Chair Rainville and council members. For the record, my name is Fatima Moore, and I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for the City of Minneapolis. And perhaps similar to you, Chair Rainville, I'm also a little nervous but excited at the same time that we're in person and doing this. So forgive me if I have any hiccups along the way as well. The 2 items that IJR will be presenting on today are definitely one, what's happening at the ledge agenda, the state legislature, and then information related to congressional earmarks. They became a thing again in 2021, and we received information a couple of weeks ago that Congress will be engaging in the process again, so we'll be presenting on the work that IGR has been doing with departments in soliciting project ideas that could be recommended through the earmarks process for the 2023 budget cycle. So I'll go ahead and begin with our presentation. The legislature is currently in recess. Over the last 3 weeks, legislators have been engaged on preparing for 3 really important deadlines. The first was a deadline that ensured that any bill that was going to be moving through to the end of session made it through one committee and then subsequently other committees, so that by last Friday, a bill needed to make it and be sitting either heard or ready to be heard in a finance committee in the House and Senate. So the legislature has done that work. We are at the point where we have a plethora of omnibus bills, which are essentially a slew of individual bills that then make up one bill regarding a particular issue. What I will be describing to us today, and I think I might move this, there we go. What I will be describing today are the omnibus bills that have moved through session, and we'll be pulling out some information related to the city of Minneapolis. I will note that the presentation is not exhaustive of all funding or policies in the bill, but if you do have additional questions for the team and I, please feel free to reach out and we can provide more in-depth information on something that you're looking for. We know that session ends on May 23rd, and so we have approximately 5 weeks left for legislators to decide on what will be passed at the end of session. For some context, the legislature funded the state for the biennium last year. So although we are at this point where we have an almost projected $10 billion budget surplus, technically the legislature does not need to spend additional funding because State departments are funded at an appropriate level, roads, bridges are funded. So the need to spend that $10 billion is really up for grabs right now, and that'll really rely on if there's a will to ultimately spend that money come end of session. I'll start with some of the provisions and policies that are included in the tax bill, and we'll provide some context around the $1.65 billion that is to be an estimated tax reduction if this bill were to pass. The House tax bill, we would see a reduction of about $1.6 billion. That means that the additional tax that could be collected from this tax bill would be $54.3 billion as well. The tax bill includes quite a few provisions. There's federal conformity. Due to the COVID-related bills that were passed in 2020 and 2021, there are some activities that individuals are not able to capture tax benefits from, and so this House bill essentially attempts to conform so that people are not having to pay additional money for dollars that they receive from the federal government as well. The bill also includes some income tax rebates. It expands the eligibility for income tax rebates. It also includes a working family tax credit as well, expanding that provision. And it establishes a local affordable housing aid program. And the city of Minneapolis, cities are eligible for these dollars. So the city of Minneapolis, if this bill were to pass, for example, we'll see about a $1.9 million appropriation from the state in this new affordable housing program. The bill also makes some Social Security changes. It essentially expands the income brackets for individuals who can receive no tax on their Social Security benefits up until a certain amount. You'll notice that when I get to the Senate side offers a complete zero taxation of all Social Security benefits. The House bill, I believe, sets it at 75K. So if you are making 75K, you essentially not be taxed up to 75K. You would not be taxed on that. The bill also includes a state aid that we receive from Minnesota, local government aid. Every 10 years, local government aid, for many reasons, it's recalculated. And the last time that the formula to determine how much cities get from local government aid was recalculated in about 10 years ago. So we're at the point again where legislators are looking at the formula, determining what exact information is used to know exactly how much cities get from LGA. And we're at the point where there's a new formula under the House bill, and under the new formula, the city would receive about $81 million in local government aid. Over the last 2 years, the city has seen a gradual decrease in our LGA amount from the state, and so we're working with the League of Minnesota Cities, Metro Cities, and other partners to ensure that this new formula hopefully passes in a Senate House bill, and that the city does not continue to see a reduction in our LGA amount as well. So I'll move over now to the Senate side. Unlike the House, the current Senate tax bill addresses two issues only. The chair of the Senate Tax Committee did say that this is one tax bill and that An additional tax bill is going to be released once they go back into session. So this tax bill essentially addresses two issues. One, it completely eliminates the Social Security tax, and then it makes those federal conformity that are quite similar to what the House is doing in their bill as well. If no questions there, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. On to housing. Absolutely.
I'd like to recognize Robin. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Rainville, Director Moore. I just had a quick question. How much revenue and taxes does Minneapolis bring basically to the state of Minnesota?
Chair and Councilmember Wansley-Roble, I don't have that number in front of me right now, but I can get that to you. We are certainly a net contributor. We are a regional player generally, and so there are a lot of taxes that the state of Minnesota collects from individuals, businesses, et cetera, within the city of Minneapolis. But I can get that information to you.
Thank you, Fatima. And I'm curious, I know in the past that issue has been raised, that Minneapolis contributes so much, but yet we get so little. How does that play when you bring that fact, or maybe someone else can answer? I see you're nodding your head.
Chair, can you repeat your question exactly?
So clearly, Robin is right. Mm-hmm. We contribute a lot of money to the state of Minnesota, but yet we get very little in return. And I think that's an important number to understand. But I'm asking, in the past, as our lobbyists have put that effort forward, that knowledge, how is that received at the state?
Yeah, Chair Rainville, council members, that's a really great question, and it's certainly one that we raise repeatedly at the legislature. You do have legislators who represent many different districts within the state of Minnesota who really are working collectively to ensure that all of their districts benefit. For the city of Minneapolis, for example, when COVID hit and after the civil unrest, there was an analysis done by the Minneapolis Chamber, and I don't have the data in front of me precisely, but they did a pretty comprehensive analysis to assess in number how much the city of Minneapolis contributes to the state's coffer, and it was substantial. And we use that information, it's a reality, right? We use that information to advocate on behalf of our businesses and residents at the state of Minnesota. There's a lot of complexity in that though, because we are working with, like I said, other cities. We know that we are a regional player. We know that we oftentimes are seeing one of the most acute disparities as well, because we are a region that's attractive, and so people come out to the city of Minneapolis. However, we have a split legislature right now. So we have a Senate that's led by Republican leadership and the House that's led by Democratic leadership. Ultimately, they have to find an agreement, and so we haven't been at the point where there is an agreement that really outsizes the benefits that the city of Minneapolis adds to the state because of politics. Politics just essentially play into the mix.
Go ahead, Councilmember Wansley.
Thank you for that. And just to build upon Chair Rainville's question, and how does that factor as you're revisiting? I know you mentioned you're working with the League of Minnesota Twin Cities to really revisit how we're reshaping the LGA. And I guess, is that going to be brought into considerations then with that? That
Chair Rainville, Councilmember Wansley-Roble, yes. One of the many changes that are being considered in the reformulation process is housing stock, as well as the number of low-income housing, because again, we do know that within the city of Minneapolis, we have a lot of acute needs, and it's needs related to housing, food access, jobs, education, et cetera. So that's why, as this formula is being revisited, it's really important that we are weighing in with the factors that should be considered so that we see the most benefit coming to the city of Minneapolis as well. and I'll move on to the next slide. Oh no, housing. So housing, another really big issue. And while housing is an issue definitely most acute in the city, there's a beginning recognition that housing issues are being experienced statewide as well. And so because of that, we're starting to see much more funding allocated to housing at the state of Minnesota. So you'll see that for the House bill, there's about $230 million allocated in fiscal year 2023 toward housing, and then continued funding in future years, or base funding, of $185 million. A pool of funds at the city of Minneapolis and a lot of affordable housing and developers who build affordable housing access is the Housing Infrastructure Bonds Program through Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. This bill proposes to increase HIBs by $400 million. It also proposes to increase by $50 million to develop a new program that supports first-time generation home buyers. So people whose families in the past have not been able to become homeowners, this is a really targeted program to help those individuals essentially become homeowners. A sort of gap financing fund at Minnesota Housing Finance Agency as well is the Challenge Program. This bill proposes to add $20 million to that program. Additionally, family homeless assistance programs. This is a program that focuses on families who are experiencing homelessness with children, $15 million to that. And then the Homework Starts at Home program, which is very similar to another program that the city of Minneapolis has. It allocates $10 million to that program. In addition, the city has a local housing trust fund, and this is actually the second, if this were to pass, this would be the second year ever that the state would offer funds to a local government's local housing fund program. And so the bill proposes $7 million to that program. And in addition to that, there's been a lot of discussion on tenant protections and tenant rights. And so you'll see that there are quite a few provisions that make it into the bill. This is not inclusive of all the bills that have dealt with tenant protections, but there are some heat code requirements included in the policy provision. There are some restrictions on when a landlord may enter a resident's apartment, and there's also some policies around pre-eviction notice filing, similar to the policies that were implemented when the eviction moratorium was in effect in the state.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. I believe we have a question from Councilmember Worsley.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Rainville. I will note too, we're still in a pandemic. I know lots of constituents probably all across our wards have struggled with paying particularly their rents and mortgages. And I know specifically the Rent Help Minnesota program was very crucial in providing rental assistance to so many working class households, and was very disheartened that our lawmakers did not see it necessary to continue that. Has that resurfaced at all? I know I've been contacted by numerous stakeholder groups to say we need to continue funding rental assistance, specifically through that program. Has there been any discussion on that?
Chair Rainville and council member, yes, there have been increased conversations on rental assistance, and then particularly emergency rental assistance, which is really what the state funded when the eviction moratorium was in effect. Actually, one of our delegation members, Representative Agbaje, is the chief author of a bill that looks at increasing emergency rental assistance. Though you'll see in the Omnibus bills in the House and Senate, none of those provisions are included. Emergency rental assistance is not included in the Omnibus bills. That's not because of lack of interest or lack of desire. There's a different strategy there to move it likely as a standalone, as an individual bill, as opposed to including it in an Omnibus bill. But it's still a topic of discussions. Advocate groups, including the Homes for All Coalition, which the city is a part of, Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, other local governments are all advocating for additional funding for emergency rental assistance. And this is in addition from any standing rental assistance funding through Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. So I hope that answers your question. But yes, it's still a point of discussion at the legislature.
And we have, I want to recognize Councilmember Chavez.
Thanks, Chair Rainbow and Director Moore. Just want to ask, so last year we were able to pass a bill that would require like high-rise buildings to have sprinklers in them at the state. And I was wondering if this year the House Omnibus Bill includes any funding for that to happen for enforcement, or if maybe at the federal level, but we can touch on that offline, I guess. Just trying to figure out if there's any funding this year for that.
Yeah, Chair Rainville and Councilmember Chavez, yes. Representative Noor has the bill in the House, and Senator Dietzig has the bill in the Senate. And there was a provision that was included in a bill last year in an omnibus bills, and I can't recall what it is exactly, and I can get back to you on that. But the bill required certain high rises to be retrofitted with sprinklers. It did not appropriate funding. This year now the strategy is to offer funding so that we can help, the legislature can help pay for some of that cost as well.
Thank you.
Chair, I believe there may be another question.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you, Councilmember Osmond. Please speak.
Yes, thank you, Chair Rainville, and thank you, Director Moore. Has there been any discussion or any funding for homeless individuals, especially addressing encampments in the city of Minneapolis or anywhere in the state? How to address those and any resource they put forward for that?
Chair and Councilmember Osmond, there certainly has been a lot of discussion on encampment support, both policies for how to work with a location where there is an encampment, as well as funding for shelters for folks who are experiencing homelessness, and nonprofits that also provide services. So separate from the structure that houses an individual who is experiencing homelessness, but also to help pay for the individuals who are offering some of those support services. Regarding the shelter piece, that is included in that could be included in a House bonding bill. Bonding bills typically move separate from agency funding bills, and that's yet to be, a bonding bill is yet to be determined. That typically happens at the end of session. However, the governor has proposed, I believe, $72 million for emergency shelter capital funding to help with upgrading existing shelters, as well as to build new shelters. There's also some funding in the Health and Human Services Omnibus bills through a program called the Emergency Support Services Program that pays for shelter providers. And then there's an additional program as well, which I'll touch on once I get to that portion. So yes, that's certainly a discussion point.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. And I'd like to recognize Councilmember Chuck Dye.
Thank you, Chair Rainville and Director Moore. I know you and your team work really, really hard during this time of year to help advocate for Minneapolis's priorities at the Capitol. Thank you for all of your work. I've just got a question for you. I know that many of us became aware or familiar with this over the last year, that we are preempted in many ways at the state level from enacting rent control or rent stabilization policy, but that there is a loophole or a way around that preemption through putting through the consent of voters in a local government and a municipality like ours. I wonder if you can speak to the types of conversations happening in the House and in the Senate on the state of that workaround or that loophole and what the future may bring.
Yeah, Chair and Councilmember Chuck Dye, definitely. You're absolutely correct. really, even prior to 2022, there were discussions around what could be happening in the city of Minneapolis around rent stabilization, rent control. Those terms are used interchangeably. And in the Senate side, there's a lot of chatter and legislation that's moving around rent control, and particularly preempting cities from enacting any rent control policies. Some of that discussion even go as far to enact policies that retroactively preempt a city. So for example, there is a bill by the chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate that essentially does that. It would be such that if the bill were to pass, even though Minneapolis ballot measure passed in November, it retroactively has a date of, I believe, 2020, and so that would essentially negate the city's rent stabilization policy. And I'll direct you to what the Senate Omnibus Bill includes, because it does essentially include that. There is a provision that preempts cities. So the two cities that currently have rent controls are the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul. There have been hearings on it. The city has submitted a letter. We've also had our staff from the housing division within CPET testify as well on what our policy currently says, which we don't have a policy yet, and also attempting to offer data around what the rental housing landscape looks like within the city of Minneapolis. In addition to that, and what's really beneficial is that we do have our associations like the League of Minnesota Cities and Metro Cities working in tandem with us, because ultimately they want to make sure that there's local control. Locals have the ability to control the policies that are enacted in their own cities. But that's definitely one of the points. None of these policies are moving in the House.
That's helpful. I appreciate that clarification. I appreciate you stating again for the public record that in the city of Minneapolis, we don't have a rent stabilization policy at this time that's enacted. Just that we have the ability to do that now with the consent of voters. Can you speak to at all what your instinct or how your team is assessing the likelihood of that moving through the legislature this year?
Chair and Councilmember Chaktai, anything's possible at the end of session, especially toward the end of session, where things are extremely intense now, they become even more intense. And so there could be little opportunities here and there for a legislator to attempt to sneak in a policy provision even on the Senate floor or on the House floor. So we are very vigilant and are watching extremely closely to ensure that the city's rights are protected on all issues, not only on rent control. I don't want to say that rent control isn't going to pass because I don't know what their future holds, but we will continue to be vigilant.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before we continue, I'd like to recognize Council President Jenkins has arrived. Welcome.
All right. We'll briefly touch on what's in the Senate, because as you'll see, there aren't as many provisions in the Senate side. The Senate does include give $50 million in fiscal year 23 for housing across the board, and that's $10 million for workforce and affordable housing homeownership. And then there's a new homeownership development program. It's not targeted at affordable homeownership. It's just generally homeownership development program, and that's $35 million. Moving on to policies, in addition to the rent control preemption, the Senate this session and in previous sessions has attempted many times to limit the kinds of policies that cities are able to enact regarding development, and particularly around PUDs. And so these provisions are included in this bill. And again, we're watching very, very closely just to make sure that as things progress, none of these pass. If no more questions on housing, I'll move on to the next slide. Health and Human Services, again, starting with the House, there's approximately $833 million in fiscal year 23. Because of COVID, there's definitely been a recognition that local public health plays a crucial role in responding to local health issues. And so last year, there was some additional funds allocated for local public health purposes, and proposed in this bill is $20 million for local public health. In addition, there's $9 million in grants to local public health for emergency preparedness. This was not the case prior to COVID. Local public health did not have this level of accessibility to funds, so if this were to pass, it's going to go a really long way to ensuring that we're prepared for future emergencies as well. School-based clinics, there's $367K allocated for those programs, and then in addition, $5 million for food support grants for food shelves, food banks, and meal supports. Again, a recognition that we are in a crisis when it comes to food access, and the legislature is, through this program, attempting to address some of that. $75 million in grants for emergency shelter facilities. And this was a question that was asked before as well. And so this is a pool of fund that existing facilities can gain access to for capital costs and needs, et cetera. There's $35 million for emergency services grants. So these are the dollars that help to employ the individuals who are delivering the services within emergency shelters. And then there's $3.06 million in grants to help with addressing the opioid epidemic statewide. On the Senate side, there's some policy changes around telehealth and televisits to basically make sure that those kinds of services are covered by medical assistance. And then the bill also establishes a Department of Behavioral Health and then specifies certain duties for the commissioner under the bill. So not as much related to the program and funding. And as you'll see when we move through the remaining slides as well, that I think I stated this before, and forgive me if I didn't, but there are two different positions in the legislature. The House definitely looks at the budget surplus and is looking for ways to prioritize spending in children's and families and workers. And on the Senate side, there's just a general understanding that they funded the state for the biennium, and so therefore don't really need to spend funds unnecessarily.
And I'd like to recognize Councilmember Warbula.
Thank you, Chair Rainville. In relation to this particular section, and I know from working closely with the state legislator last year, we often loop in child care support with our public health and human services. So wanted to see if there's any movement on that. I know I worked closely with a coalition last year of child care providers who've named time and time again they are not receiving the funding that they need, or subsidies that they need to provide quality and consistent child care to working class families. And I'm pretty sure many of us have probably been contacted by our constituents also about just the shortage of staffing for our centers. So want to know if there's any movement on that. I know I even worked on a bill around also increasing workforce standards for child care providers. So we'll love to know if there's any action happening around that.
Yeah, Chair Rainville and Councilmember Wanzi were all about their child care. And childcare affordability is one of the top issues at the legislature. And so while you don't see it listed here, we would need multiple slides to list all the things that are included in all of these bills. There's provisions in the Health and Human Services bill for childcare particularly. There's also provisions in the House Jobs bill for some of the workforce readiness. And I believe that may be included in the Jobs Omnibus Bill slide as well. So I can provide more information to you about what specifically is included, but childcare cost and the worker shortage as it relates to that is really one of the top issues.
Thank you, Director Moore. And also knowing if there might be another time, just in reflecting on, 3 weeks ago, we had this historic teacher strike here in Minneapolis. I know there's lots of conversation of how that surplus is also going to be used to support K through 12 public education. If there's going to be opportunity to talk about, because I know that relates to childcare in many ways too. So wanted to know if, what's going on with education kind of funding appropriations too, in ways the city of Minneapolis can also receive some of that to support our schools here.
Yeah, Chair Rainville and Councilmember Wansley Warlabaugh, the recent teacher strike was certainly a high-level topic at the legislature as well. And one of our delegation members, Representative Daphne, chairs the House Education Committee, and so he's been really engaged in their bill. We did not include a slide on the education piece because there really isn't a lot of provision related to the city of Minneapolis in in that omnibus bill, but I can provide more information to you. There's a lot of funding for youth programming, summer schools, food access, and there's some policy changes there as well. But we can provide this information to you offhand.
Yes, thank you, Director Moore, because I would also love to know where things are moving around CRT as well. I know that's a very spicy topic at the state level as well.
Yep, absolutely. Chair, Councilmember, we'll provide those information to you. And Chair, I'll move to the next slide. Jobs. All right. So there has been obviously a lot of discussion on workforce shortages in many different careers. The House Job Bill proposes to allocate $175 million in new funds in fiscal year 2023. A portion of those would go to a local workforce board through our Community Planning and Economic Development Department. There's a staff member there who is a part of the local workforce board, and we've been working with them to advocate for more programming dollars that can be focused to our local workforce boards, because they're the ones talking with the individuals who are looking for jobs. They can clearly identify the kinds of trainings that are needed, et cetera. And so the bill proposes $20 million, which is, for the first time, that's pretty amazing. $20 million coming to a local workforce board. In addition, the bill also proposes $25 million to a targeted community capital grants. This is a grant for nonprofits to gain access to capital funds. The bill also proposes making some policy changes to the program that makes it a bit more accessible to nonprofits who can gain access to the funds as well. The bill creates also a new department within the Department of Employment and Economic Development, a new American office. This office will be focused on new immigrants who come to the state of Minnesota and will help support them with job training, education, et cetera, to get them ready to enter the workforce. The bill also creates a new small business low or zero interest program. $45 million would go to that program, and the program targets businesses with 50 people or less. Again, recognizing that small businesses have been struggling, and some of the existing programs, even at the state appropriated funding to last session, have been difficult for small businesses to access, and so this is an attempt to address some of that need as well. The bill also put $20 million toward an emerging developer program. This is a program that was created because there was a recognition that Black and brown people who are interested in becoming developers really find it difficult to gain access to funds, to capitals, and so this bill helps to address some of that need. And then there's a $35 million that funds a pandemic relief program, and this program is actually it's a new program that's created for nonprofits and for-profit businesses who work within the food, beverage, personal services, indoor entertainment, indoor fitness, and recreation and wellness industries. Again, recognizing that during the pandemic, those were some of the shuttered businesses, the businesses that were not able to stay open due to COVID. And so recognizing a need to get more dollars to them as well. What's not on here is one really important program that we continue to hear about, which is the Main Street program. And that program was created in 2021 in an effort to help bring money directly to local businesses. The House bill adds an additional $20 million to that program. The bill also allows the Department of Economic Development to essentially waive the match requirement that is currently stated in the program. And so that was because there were legislators in the agency, frankly, just heard from a lot of people who still had needs, but because of the really strict requirements, didn't get any of the funds because they didn't have funds to really match the state's fund as well. So that's why you see these programs here. On the Senate side, the Senate appropriates roughly $279,000. The Senate appropriates $175K to study the adequacy of current benefit levels that are available currently to disabled or injured police officers, firefighters, and state troopers. The bill also provides $50K for a grant program with horses to help with experiential learning and mental health therapy for first responders. The bill also establishes a grant program for students who are interested in pursuing a career in law enforcement, and that lifetime grant amount is $3K per student. And then the bill amends the Workforce Development Scholarship Program to include programs for individuals who are interested in studying law enforcement, and then makes an annual scholarship of $5K for those individuals in that program.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Council President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Rainville and Director Moore. My question, you mentioned Main Street program. Are they reducing the match or allowing for other governmental funds to play a role in the match?
Chair Rainville and Council President, the bill increases, I'll pause and then start back. Last year, the legislature allocated funds to the program. The first round of funds went out, I want to say fall of 2021. And most recently, within the last month, I believe, the second round of funds were released. The dollars went to 3 foundations who are then assigned with sub-allocating those dollars out to businesses within certain communities. There's no more, since the second round of funds are out, there's currently no more dollars in the program. So the House is proposing to allocate an additional $20 million to the program for future rounds of sub-allocation, and to allow the commissioner to determine, so they give him discretion, they give the current commissioner the discretion to determine if that match requirement is waived or not.
Okay. So
It does, and to answer, I think another part of your question, it does not give any ability for local government to sub-allocate those dollars out. It continues with those 3 foundations that were originally named in the originating bill.
And as it stands, you can't use federal or local funds as a match.
I'm not well versed on all of the Chair and Council President. I'm not well versed on the details of the program and exactly how the match requirements go. I do know that if a business, for example, in the city of Minneapolis, wanted to access the funds, there's some difficulty in utilizing ARPA funds for it because of the strict requirements at the federal level. Mm-hmm. If there were general fund dollars that the state had and wanted to supplant or help a business with their match to access the state funds, that's allowable. However, even with that, we have seen over the last year now that that is still difficult because of a lack of access to capital generally. And so that's why the commissioner is allowed instead to waive that match requirement.
At his discretion or at their?
At their, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Moore. I do have I'd like to recognize Councilmember Wansley Warloba.
Thank you, Chair Rainbow, Director Moore. I just have 3 questions, but also want to start by saying thank you for your work around the small business, advocacy component in my ward. We have many businesses who were either destroyed and continue to be impacted financially from the devastation that took place when MPD killed George Floyd, and everything that took place around the 3rd precinct. And I know I get contacted pretty frequently by our small businesses who have received little to no support from this particular initiative and other supports that is apparently in existence. So thank you for your work in trying to strengthen and expand resources, direct resources to small business owners, and I'm really looking forward to working with you. I know I've been in conversations with our city attorneys to do a small business public hearing in my ward with some of those folks to let them know what resources are available to them. So thank you for your leadership on that. The 3 questions that I had was, is there any movement around increasing allocations to the Frontline Workers Fund? I know there was $1 billion last year. Many essential workers are still struggling. And as you mentioned, even with childcare, we're experiencing staffing shortages all across the state because people don't want to go to work and earn poverty wages in the midst of a pandemic that's still very financially devastating for most working class people. The second question that I had was actually around some of the dynamics I'm seeing around the Senate's proposal with lots of, higher education support for those entering into law enforcement. We recognize there's staff shortages that's happening all across different industries. Are we providing similar, or are there conversations to extend similar supports, for instance, to, again, with the teachers? We just had a strike with the ESPs. Our schools are facing staff shortages. Are they providing student debt support for those to bring them into the field? We know there's staffing shortages in hospitals. I went to Zumba last night, actually in Councilmember Vital's ward, and they're experiencing staffing shortages of custodians for our after-school centers. Here's an opportunity to support them as well. So is there any discussion around how we're also using dollars to also, bring support to other workers in different industries who could use help with higher education, with professional development, to get them not only into these fields, but to also retain them?
Chair and Councilmember Worlbot, I heard 2 questions, and okay. So around the frontline workers question, frontline workers generally are definitely priorities of both chambers, the House and the Senate. What those priorities look like and how they translate into legislation looks completely different. And so for the House side, you'll see that there are individual bills that have, for example, the speaker named as the chief author or leadership named as the chief author that are not included in these larger omnibus bills, and those are to be carried as standalone bills. Those are the caucus's priorities. So those have been heard through committees and are awaiting end of session from when negotiation happens. And similarly, you're absolutely right. What we are seeing in the Senate side is we're seeing support for workers, and those workers are the kinds of workers that are getting support and that you're hearing more about are, law enforcement careers, higher paying jobs careers, as opposed to our low income, low wage workers. So that discussion's happening. It'll continue to happen even alongside these omnibus bills moving, but will ultimately, if decisions are made on those, essentially if bills are passed related to frontline workers, those are caucus's priorities, and therefore they will not happen until the end of session. you know, there was an agreement in 2021 as well on the frontline workers' pay. And ultimately, there was a work group that was put together to determine the calculation, how much each worker was going to get. And the work group members were unable to find agreement on that. So that is now back at the legislature, and all legislators, again, are determining exactly what the calculation is going to look like and if there's even going to be an ability to pass that frontline workers' pay. Secondly, I believe I answered part of your question around the Senate's bills that you're hearing a lot more of. However, they also do have some provisions that are related to funding for higher paying jobs, or if you'll see in some of the other bills, there are programs that they're allocating limited dollars to that help with developing businesses and manufacturing businesses, et cetera, just not those that we see mostly here in the city of Minneapolis.
Thank you, Director Moore. And I'd like to recognize Councilmember Chavez.
Chair Rainbow, thank you, and Director Moore. Before I became a council member, I actually worked on this committee. So I worked for Representative Noor and on the Omnibus Bill that we passed in 2021. So I do know that this work isn't easy, and I do appreciate the work that you're doing for all of us at the state legislature when it's very split and it's hard to get anything done from political ideologies. I was just wondering, the governor went on Lake Street and talked about the $20 million Main Street funding. And I know that funding is oftentimes very difficult for our communities, and you touched base on that a little bit. But I was wondering that when that passes, because I do expect that to pass, would we be willing and able to work with our city of elected officials, the ones at the state legislature, the Minneapolis ones, to figure out what the requirements and descriptions can be, if we can change that? Because we can pass it, but we can also change the description once that passes to make sure that it's more accessible to our communities of color and our communities that oftentimes can't have access to these funds. You touched base on that, but wondering if there's work we can do after, once it passes, to make sure that it's accessible.
Yeah, Chair Rainville and Councilmember Chavez, yes, and you worked with Chair Noor as well, who is one of our delegation members, and we've been working in close contact with Chair Noor. And I can tell you that one of the reasons why you see both an increase in the Main Street program as well as an attempt to lessen some of the requirements for businesses is based on the engagement with some of you, and the engagement with businesses, and engagement with, and it's with businesses in the city of Minneapolis and businesses statewide as well who have not been able to access the funds. Regarding if there's an ability to work on the program language, I think that's yet to be determined. That's essentially dictated to DEED to ultimately do. I do think it would be helpful if if DEED is hearing from businesses about some of the difficulties that they are experiencing outside of what the legislation states. Some of the policies, the programming policies that could be changed to make it a little bit more accessible to them. However, I will say, though, a lot of the language is pretty strict already based on the legislation, right? Because the reason why this original program was agreed to in 2021 was based on an agreement between the House and Senate leadership on what should be funded. Again, if you look at the jobs bill, you don't, on the Senate side, you don't see anything related to lessening the language restrictions or even additional funding in the program. And so, Senator Pratt, as a chair, does feel like the program was set up to work the way that it was. So you would ultimately need to find agreement with them to make any additional changes. And I'll move quickly through the other slides as well. So we've got the next Omnibus Bill, which is the bill that essentially funds the state of Minnesota, state agencies, and then includes some elections-related provisions as well. $46.4 million is allocated in fiscal year 2023 for this program. As relates to the city, there is $1.79 million in cybersecurity grants that the city of Minneapolis would be able to apply for through a grant program. There are some elections-related provisions in this bill as well, and I'm just going to highlight on some of the top ones for you. The bill would require a minimum number of voting locations for ballot boxes based on the number of voters in a jurisdiction. Ballot boxes were passed in the biennial budget in 2021, and so this provision essentially helps to ensure that a certain number are located within a distinct radius. The bill also expands the number of days prior to an election that a ballot can be dropped off. At certain locations, it updates and clarifies language related to the right of individuals who can contest the accuracy or completeness of data on themselves with local governments. The bill designates a statewide Americans with Disability Act and creates a disability employment director at the state level. The bill also ensures that state statutes comply with the Federal Equal Rights Amendment, and it expands some public funds of some ability for local governments around bond investments. And so those are some of the high-level things that are included in the House State Gov and Elections Bill. On the Senate side, the bill appropriates $50 million in fiscal year 2023. It allocates $6 million of those funds for grants to local governments to live stream ballot boxes. This is a requirement that was added in the elections bill last year, and so now they're providing $6 million to help support some of the costs of live streaming ballot boxes if a local government decides to utilize those. The bill also makes $1 million grant one time to local governments for absentee ballot boxes, and makes changes to how non-governmental entities like nonprofits, for example, label voter information that you receive during an election in their mailboxes. So as to clarify what are official, for example, an official mail-in ballot, as opposed to what is an informational campaign material related to a said issue that a nonprofit's supporting or opposing. The bill also establishes a board of ballot observers, and then it makes several other changes to absentee ballots. Not seeing any questions, I'm going to move on. Public safety.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Councilmember Goodman. Thank you,
Thank
Lisa.
you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for your report. I'm not sure which slide my two questions come in, so I'll just ask now. It might have been taxes. It could be finance. I'm interested in where our effort to change the boundaries for the downtown taxing district landed. And my second question has to do with some communications I've had with various legislators in the Minneapolis delegation surrounding this issue of the stadium bonds being paid off and our ability to be relieved of the $150 million contribution that no one left on this council now supported, just to be clear, and the way that we could reuse that $150 million towards economic development on Lake Street and in other areas. So when I have legislators calling me, asking me if I think this is a good thing to do, it means something's happening behind the scenes. So I'm wondering if you could speak to those two issues, please.
Chair Rainville and Councilmember Goodman. Yeah, so I'll start with the downtown taxing district. The state legislature passed a law a couple of sessions ago, and I can't recall exactly which session, I want to say maybe 2019, that required local governments, if they're going to be making any changes to existing local tax laws, or creating new ones, that there were steps that had to be taken. One of the first steps included the local government's council passing a resolution addressing said tax change. After that resolution was passed, it then would need to be submitted to the chairs of the tax committee in the House and Senate, and by a certain deadline as well. After that is when then you begin working on legislation to do what essentially you're going to do. So I've been working with our finance folks and our CPED folks, our teams, to determine where they're determining what that new boundary will be, and I believe it's going to be coming to the council relatively soon as well, what that that expansion of the downtown taxing district is going to be. Once we get that resolution, then we can take all the necessary steps, send it to the chairs of the House and Senate committees, work with our delegation members as well to draft a bill that reflects what that change is going to be, and then move it through. I'll note that the downtown taxing change has been on our ledge agenda for the last 4 or 5 years. I think perhaps the first year that I started working for the city. And at that point, we were working with Senator Dietzick as well to have her be the chief author of the Senate bill. And there was a lot of there was a recommendation that the council should determine that boundary first and then come to the legislature with that boundary. So while we are 5 weeks out of session, I'm not certain that it's going to be feasible to get this done this session, but I do know that we are in the works with our finance folks and communicating about what that boundary should be, as well as working with the Department of Revenue to help assess what that new tax capacity is going to be for businesses that are, for the expansion of the boundary and the businesses that are going to be included in there.
Mr. Chair, so it's disappointing that this has been on our agenda for a really long time, and we're still hearing that the things that we need to do haven't been done. I've met with finance staff twice, so I'm confident that the boundary has been set and agreed to. So I'm somewhat surprised that this is not moving anywhere. And for my colleagues, just to understand what this means, the boundary for the downtown taxing district was developed more than 20 years ago, before all of downtown was actually developed. So now we have a situation where some of the businesses in the North Loop pay the extra 3% tax, and right across the street they don't. So it's become an issue as it pertains to like First Avenue paying the tax, but the Fillmore doing the exact same thing 8 blocks away not paying the tax. And so this is an issue of equity and fairness within these businesses. No one's talking about jumping the boundary to add other wards. This is primarily within the 2nd, the 3rd, 7th, and 5th wards, and it's to try to have businesses of like concern paying the same tax. So the Monte Carlo is paying the extra 3%, but Parlor's not. Free House is not, but Mercury was, because there was no, and it's no one's fault. I mean, downtown grew, thank goodness, over time, and now we need to figure out how to have everyone paying about the same thing, and potentially drop the rate a little bit so that there is more equity within these various businesses. Otherwise, First Avenue is essentially at a disadvantage for recruiting concerts to the Fillmore, because one is paying this entertainment tax and passing it along to customers, and the other is not. And I have, been very vocal in the importance of getting this done, and I have personally worked with finance staff to agree to the boundaries, so I'm somewhat surprised that we're now even a year out. Hopefully, we'll see more concerts this year, and it won't be up to full speed, but I would say by the end of the pandemic, maybe when the convention business starts coming back, it's really something we should be pushing, and I hope that we can move this a little bit faster than the 4 years it's been on our legislative agenda with no work. If it's my job personally to see this through, I'm happy to step up, but I've never heard it was my job to make it happen. So if it is, I'll own it.
Chair Rainville and Councilmember Goodman, if I can clarify, while the policy position has been on our ledge agenda, the clear boundary and details around what that boundary is hasn't been developed until, I would say, about a month and a half ago. And so now that we actually have an updated drawn out boundary, now we can go to Department of Revenue and say, hey, here are these boundaries, here are the businesses that are going to be included in there. And also, to your point, Councilmember Goodman, we also want to ensure that the tax capacity doesn't increase, but that it'll likely decrease slightly, since the boundary will be expanded, more people will be paying this tax, and therefore I will say the tax burden essentially is spread out more. But we didn't have a boundary until about a month and a half ago. So now we're able to do our legislative work to see that this then translates into legislation. And then the stadium finance bill, yes. There are 2 bills moving two bills. I wouldn't actually say moving quite yet. There are two bills, one in the House and one in the Senate. The bill on the Senate side is chaired by Senator Rosen. She was the chief author of the Vikings bill when it was originally created. And the House bill is chief author by Chair Nelson. He's actually the chair of the State Gov committee as well. We've been in discussions with both of them around what the bill ultimately does. What the bill seeks to do is it would, when the bonds are ready to be called in 2023, it would require the commissioner of MMB to take advantage of this lower tax rate and refinance the bonds and potentially pay off the debt about 15 or 16 years sooner than intended. That means that the state's share of the bonds, which I believe are it's $364 million, the city added $150 million to the funds, and then the Vikings paid a little over $605 million for their share. If the stadium debt is refinanced in 2023 at a certain tax rate, it's uncertain what that tax rate is yet because we won't know until we actually refinance the bonds. The state would ultimately reduce its share of debt to the bonds. So the $364 million that the state paid would be reduced to some lower amount. For the city of Minneapolis, we paid $150 million. We want to make sure that our share of the bonds are also lowered so that there is parity. If the state's going to be reducing its share of the bonds, it's $365, then the $150 that the city paid is also reduced at a similar rate. And so that's the discussion that we've been in with them. There hasn't been any decision quite yet on what to do. We've had meetings with finance. We've had meetings with our city coordinator's office as well. I've had conversations with individual legislators as well. I've communicated with Senator Rosen. I've worked with Senate counsel so that we can determine a language that ultimately is put into this bill if it passes, so that Minneapolis benefits from any refinancing that happens with the bill. What we are seeing with the stadium refinance fund, which the Stadium Refinance Fund was created for such this moment, if and when it was an opportune time that the legislature could pay off the debt early, they would be able to utilize some of these funds to pay it off. The fund currently has over $200 million sitting in the fund. It's projected to increase exponentially by next year and then continue increasing because pull tabs are doing really well. So if the state legislature ultimately refinances and pays the debt off early, we want to make sure that the city of Minneapolis reduces its share of the debt, currently $150 million. Difficult to determine what that amount is yet without knowing what the refinancing calculation is going to be. I believe that's it for State Gov. And we'll move to public safety. Public safety, most definitely another big topic at the legislature. And what you'll see are the comparisons between the House and the Senate bill. The House bill appropriates almost $190 million in fiscal year 2023. It offers quite a few grants which local governments are eligible and can apply for. One of them is local community safety grants, so it would appropriate $55 million to groups who are working on community safety programming. It would also offer $10 million for co-responder grants, $15 million for investigation grants. This would be to law enforcement, $1.5 million to combat the increase in sex trafficking, $1 million for youth intervention programs, $1.5 million for local emergency management grants. $95 million would be to create a new public safety innovation board, and then that board would then be able to grant out a portion of the $95 million to grantees who are seeking funds. The bill also appropriates $500,000 to establish and fund the Office of Missing and Murdered Black Women and Girls. It offers $5 million in grants for body-worn cameras It establishes an expungement, an auto expungement process for folks who have felonies, and then it gives some investigative authority to the post board to investigate certain kinds of egregious conducts by peace officers. What you don't see included in here, which you may have questions about, is the no-knock policy that's moving as a standalone bill and has not been included in this larger public safety omnibus package. What you'll see on the Senate bill is a $50 million spending in fiscal year 2023. It provides $20 million for peace officer recruitment, $47 million for retention bonuses for peace officers, $3 million for youth intervention programs, $1 million each for a peace officer recruitment campaign, and also funding to fund some of the Pathways to Policing programs. It creates quite a few new crimes. Some of them include a new crime for fleeing an officer in a negligent manner, as well as organized retail theft and carjacking crimes. And then it increases, again, some penalties for a list of other additional crimes. What you won't see included in here that you will see in the next slide is some more information related to catalytic converters that is technically covered in a different committee at the legislature.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Councilmember Wansley Warlaba.
Thank you, Chair Rainville. Just had two questions. So I know at the council level, especially around some of our community safety initiatives, there's been lots of questions raised, especially in Public Health and Safety Committee, around, how are we setting higher standards around accountability of the groups that we're working with, the deliverables that they're producing for our communities. I'm always interested if there's, existing precedences that we can model ourselves after, particularly at the state level. Is there any vetting or accountability measures that's outlined around this proposal for the local community safety grants? I think that would be helpful, as we're also, those of us interested in moving that work forward here on the council to possibly model after or make some tweaks. The second question, on the Senate side, I'm actually interested where this $20 million in peace officer recruitment, where would that go towards? I know there was 3 of us council members who participated in the tour of Hennepin Tech about a week and a half ago, and they produced about 50% of officers statewide. Would they be considered an institution that would, receive these fundings as well towards recruitment efforts of law enforcement?
Chair Rainville and Councilmember Wansley Warlaba. So I'll start with your last question first. The $20 million for peace officer recruitment would go to local law enforcement groups. And then secondly, I believe your question was related to the local community safety grants that the House is offering. In our discussions with the chair of the Public Safety Committee and some of his committee members, as well as staff within the city, there's a lot of learnings from the city of Minneapolis that really led to the development of this program. There was also a recognition that there needs to be more streamlined communication and collaboration so that local law enforcement understand and know who some of these groups are that are essentially delivering community safety programs. And so in the program description of the Public Safety and Innovation Board, it really details some levels of communication that needs to happen between local governments, the groups who are going to be accessing these grants, as well as state agencies. So there's the Office of Justice program. There's now going to be this new Public Safety Innovation Board and the commissioners, so that information is shared collaboratively and in real time, and that learning and innovation happens there, so that we don't get into instances where, for example, MPD may not know essentially who a group is that's delivering some community safety program, and there's just miscommunication and potential mishaps that can happen. So that's embedded into the policy language of the program as well. And that was raised, again, because there was a recognition and learnings that happened within the city of Minneapolis as well.
Thank you, Director Moore. I'd like to recognize Council President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Rainville. I'm just curious if you know this $500,000 fund for the Office of Missing and Murdered Black Women and Girls. Because I just know that Indigenous and Native women and girls are really disproportionately a part of this deeply tragic phenomenon. And so, do you have any idea why that community is not included?
Chair Rainville and Council President, yes, I can answer that question precisely because there was a previous initiative that did pass, and forgive me because all of my years are really meshing into one, but I want to say it was passed in 2019, a similar office. So there is an existing office already for murdered and Indigenous women and girls. And so this essentially is a mirror of a similar initiative, but for Black women and girls instead. And through the creation of that office, there have been a lot of programs and initiatives that's come out of that body of work. And so there's a recognition that Black women and Black girls are also experiencing disparate impact of society, and so therefore wanting to hone in and analyze data, et cetera, to see what are the learnings, and then state level programming that can be developed to address some of the needs in this population as well.
Okay, thank you. And I guess just, this is a comment, but on the Senate side, the second to last bullet point, I thought these were already crimes. I don't understand how these are new crimes.
It expands certain types. It expands certain types of crime, so it increases the penalties for these types of crimes.
Got it. So it's not necessarily a new crime. It's new. I guess measures of accountability for said crimes.
Council Chair Rainville, Council President, there are new crimes that are created, and some of those crimes are in comparison to existing crimes of similar measures. The level of penalties are increased for some of these crimes. So, for example, the crime of fleeing an officer in a negligent manner, it creates another level of crime for doing that, based on a lot of the incidents that have been happening throughout the state. So, increasing crimes is an attempt to address some of the public safety things that we've been seeing in the state level from the Senate side.
Right, thank you.
Transportation. I'll go quickly through this one. 35 million in fiscal year 23, and then 850 million in the next biennium, essentially the next 2 years, from the trunk highway funds. The bill would appropriate 10 million to municipal state aids. 36.8 million would be for the federal funds, local assistance from the federal infrastructure bill. So this will be the state's match for that funding at the federal level. Similarly, 8.5 million would be the match for multimodal funding through the bill. The bill also appropriates $740K this biennium, and then 3.7 million in the next for the daily train from the Twin Cities to Chicago. 51 million in fiscal year 23 and 34 million in 24-25, that biennium, for the Northern Lights Express passenger rail from Minneapolis to Duluth. And then it also includes 12 million for active transportation funding. On the Senate side, there's one-time spending, so in fiscal year 23, 11.4 million in municipal state aids, 188 million for the Corridors of Commerce program, there would be a prohibition, a policy prohibition in using state funds for any infrastructure funding unless it goes through the legislative process. The bill also allows local governments to veto a transit guideway at any point in the process of development. It suspends future transit guideway work by the Met Council and then adds $114 surcharge for plug-in hybrids if there is an increase in the gas tax. So those are the provisions included in the transportation bill, and this is, I believe, the final Omnibus Bill, and this one's relatively short. $6.3 million fiscal year 23. The bill appropriates $3.7 million to operate a car theft prevention program that includes measures like decoy cars that local law enforcement can access in response to the increase in these types of activities, definitely locally, but also statewide. The bill also appropriates $400K to the auto theft prevention program. The bill requires, unrelated to public safety, homeowner associations, before they begin to foreclose on a home, to notify a homeowner for non-payment of rent. This is an occurrence that we were seeing increasingly over the last two years, and so work with some of the associations and the Minnesota Homeownership Board and other groups to ensure that there's some notice to homeowners before they see foreclosure notices. The bill also attempts to discourage the theft of catalytic converters by limiting their possession and sale through certain scrap metal businesses. It does exempt registered scrap dealers from seeing any penalties if they are purchasing a catalytic converter from someone who has a license. This is an initiative it's an initiative that's been underway at the legislature for the last 3 years now to address the increase, really the rapid increase in how easy it is to for an individual to remove your catalytic converter from your car, and the cost then to replace it as well. On the Senate side, the bill puts a limit on enforcement actions initiated by the Commissioner of Commerce on businesses for certain types of violation. This was certainly based on a lot of the restrictions during the COVID pandemic that the Commissioner released. And then the bill makes changes to the dispute resolution process, including some of the fees through the Department of Commerce. That's it for the Omnibus Commerce Bill, and I'll pause there for any questions.
Thank you, Director Moore. Are there any additional questions from the council? Seeing no further discussion, I'll direct the clerk to file that report. And our second discussion, item 3, is a presentation regarding the 2023 congressionally directed spending. I'll now invite Intergovernment Relations Director, no, I see we have someone new to do that. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Lauren Olson from the Government Relations team, and I'm here today. We're primarily going to talk about the earmarks process. I feel like we've already had an intense day with a lot of information, but we'll try to get through this efficiently because we also have some staff from city departments that have been present to be able to answer questions, and we hope that they'll be able to stick around in case you have any as we go through. Just one thing before we get into earmarks is just to acknowledge that Congress finally passed their 2022 fiscal year budget about a month ago. You know, typically the fiscal year would end in October and then go till September 30th. So basically it shows the unpredictability of when Congress actually appropriates their money. How it's relevant to today's conversation is that we needed to wait until March to actually know that the earmarks from last year were really, really happening. And so now we're at a point from the earmarks from last year where we're waiting to figure out, okay, now how do we get a check for the one project we had last year? So the earmarks were included in that process. And then I'll just note one other thing about the budget for today, and that is that there was a very significant increase in money into a competitive federal program called RAISE. There's an additional 1.5 billion. RAISE is rebuilding America's infrastructure with sustainability and equity. And it's a very expansive program that can handle all different kinds of requests, from highways to pedestrian walkways to transit. So that's something you will see a lot of people trying to tap into. And if it hasn't gotten on your radar already, the city is partnering with Hennepin County on a RAISE grant, and it would support investments along a 4-mile segment of Lake Street to coincide with Beeline Bus Rapid Transit, and really ensure that that is a multimodal environment that enhances safety and really complements the Beeline. So that is being submitted. And we've already received letters of support from Senator Klobuchar and Representative Omar. We expect to get one from Senator Smith. So we really appreciate their support for us. All right, so earmarks. So earmarks were a practice of Congress in the past, but they became out of favor politically, and in 2001 they stopped. Last year the process returned, and it kind of returned hastily, and the process itself was very rushed, and there was a lot more questions than answers during the whole process. I think we were hoping that after year one, people would recognize that we need to build more time into this process and a different level of information, but it appears that that did not change for this year. So we're on an extremely accelerated timeline where we essentially have a 2-week window from the time they officially said, yes, we're doing earmarks, here's, we're publishing the opportunity for you, and then the deadlines that are quickly approaching. So we've been scrambling to work internally here at the city. And IGR, in general, one of the things that we're doing is trying to take advantage of any resource we can from, the federal government or state to advance city projects. So we're facilitating this to see if we have city projects that could take advantage of this. So just some more kind of background, the amount that Congress spends on discretionary spend is no more than 1% of discretionary spending. That could be up to $1 billion worth of earmarks, from my understanding. There are very specific accounts available for this process, and it varies on the Senate and the House side. So it's, there's a lot of things that have to come together to have a successful earmark, and we will talk more about that. In general, the idea with earmark too is that you're ready to spend it when you get it. But this is another area too where there can be differences depending on where your money is coming from and what the expectations are. So it's really a puzzle. For-profit entities are the folks that are not eligible, but that means that nonprofit entities and local governments are eligible to apply for an earmark. In general, I think the expectation is that there's community support for projects. I think when you are the government already, and if you're bringing something that the city is doing, it already kind of checks that box in some sense. But in general, it should be community supported. And as far as transparency of the process, I'm just acknowledging that the requests that go into the system, are very public, and when our members decide which projects to advance, all of that is very open to the public. So yeah, just to quickly then differentiate, again, there's 2 different processes. So on the House side, we've been using the term earmarks, but people, might prefer to use some of the formal names. In the House, it's called community project funding. There's 20 different accounts that are available for this. This year, each House member can bring 15 requests. Last year it was 10. They need to be clear that they don't have any direct financial interests. The members will rank their priorities when they submit them. Representative Omar's deadline for all of us to bring stuff to her is April 21st. And then I believe she has to report to her the committees on the 30th of April. So we're all moving very quickly. On the Senate side of the process, it's called congressionally directed spending. Again, you have specified accounts that are available for this. The submitter, meaning like us, we need to rank our projects if we have more than one when we put them into the Senate process. And this it seemed to me from last year that that the senators have less level of discretion kind of about the pathway of their request. Like they put in the request and it goes to a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, depending on the account. And what happens at that committee is a big old mystery and seems to vary by committee. So there seems to be, there's kind of a part where they lose some control over it. And so we would really need them to go the extra mile for a couple things in order to try to rein in and maintain that as a priority out of the hundreds of requests from the state. Whereas it seems on the House side, as long as the projects are really appropriate for the earmark, that what the House member selects is more likely to then stick at the end of the entire process. So before we talk about the 2023 process, just a quick look at 2022. Basically, we went through a vetting process that's similar to what I'm going to describe to you last year to go to city departments and see if they have anything that could meet this like puzzle and quick turnaround time. We identified 11 projects last year. And really what we did last year was we just kind of focused on, we identified a few top priorities projects, and those were Wood Dog Commons, which we'll talk about some more, 38th Street Thrive, school-based clinics, and the Emergency Operations Training Facility. We'll really touch on all of these as we move forward. So those were the kind of what we articulated as priorities last year. 9 of the 11 projects, we put all 11, every viable city project goes into the system because there's so much unpredictability too about, as we go, we keep learning more about what's competitive and so on. So 9 out of the 11 then our senators said, we will support these and we'll move them on to the next step. And then 1 of the 11, Representative Omar added to her list, which was Wood Dog Commons. So that project is in Seward, and it is affordable housing. It's with multifamily housing units that are more suitable for large immigrant family needs. And it was also a woman and BIPOC developer from, I think, Newer Industries who was leading that work. So that was what was funded last year. Although we're still waiting for the details on when the check is coming. So, and then I just want to note, this process supports a lot of great projects in the community. You're probably hearing from people, nonprofits making requests. So I think, at the end of the day, at the end of this process, there's going to be a lot of wonderful things supported, whether it's the city enterprise or things that we care about outside the enterprise. So last year, sprinklers for public housing, North Commons Park, Sabathany Center had some building renovations, Hennepin Healthcare East Lake Clinic. There's a very extensive list of what got funded. All right, so as far as the process that we use, again, IGR is just trying to facilitate and coordinate to see, do we have projects that the enterprise should ask for some support on? So once again, we went to the departments and said, we have this really short notice process again. There's a lot of questions that we know we still don't have answers to. Do you have something that's really ready to go, that has, that is maybe building on something you're already doing? It's not something that needs to go through the council to develop, but it's ready. And can you deal with this process? Because there's a lot of uncertainty around the process. There's speed needed in the process. You don't kind of know when you get the money. It's difficult for some people to navigate not knowing when exactly you're going to have the money in hand for a project. It's a lot of timing. So it's not an easy thing to do. And I want to, before I forget, I want to really just thank all my colleagues across the city enterprise who are already doing great work and are very busy for diving in to try to bring in more resources to the city. And for those people who are here also to answer questions. So at the end of that process, we ended up with 9 projects. Let me see, did I skip something? No, okay. We ended up with 9 projects that we thought met basic viability standards. So again, major factors here were kind of readiness to go, and also seem like a match for the earmarks process in general. We think there's potential that they could tap into that. And I'm gonna try to give the quick high-level description of these, and then in some cases, staff is here to answer questions. All right, so the first one is 38th Street United Community Development Corporation. So last year, as you may have noted on the other slide, 38th Street Thrive was listed as a second priority for the city. So the 38th Street Thrive strategic plan, and Council President knows this very well, is a community-led plan that has been adopted by the city, a plan for the 38th Street Cultural District, and it has many, many elements, so I'm kind of reluctant if I start picking one or the other. There's promoting community ownership of businesses and of development and many, many other components to it. So the Community Development Corporation would, by fully supporting the development of that community-based development corporation, they can establish themselves and the program and everything necessary to essentially guide all the elements of the strategic plan. So we're kind of creating the foundation that's going to carry all that work forward with this one. The next request is Tech Pathway. So the city of Minneapolis already has a tech hire program where people can become certified or gain skills in certain tech jobs that lead to good wages. So this would be continuing that, but it would specifically target 16 to 24-year-olds with these opportunities to access jobs. So it's a youth workforce development proposal. The third item, Plymouth Avenue Apartments, is 63 affordable housing units in North Minneapolis. That is in, I believe, the Willard Hay neighborhood, and it's been identified as an area that is gentrifying, and this project is intended to make sure that there's housing that is affordable to people who live in the community. And I don't know if someone's here to speak to that, but there's a lot more detail behind that one as well. Next item is Alternative 911 Response, Nature Code Project. So that we understand to be a continuation of the work that the Office of Performance and Innovation have been asked to do, where they were looking at the 911 calls into the city, looking at the nature of those calls, and then using that data to determine potential alternative responses, such as the behavioral crisis response teams, such as having 311 handle certain calls. So our understanding is that that type of work based on that analysis is continuing and needs more resources. The next item is replacement police radios. So again, our understanding on this is that the federal government is mandating that certain radios that are commonly used in government be upgraded to involve a certain amount of encryption. And so this is something that we understand we're going to have to deal with because it's a mandate. There are needs for radios in other parts of the city, from fire to reg services as well. But the account that is available in the earmarks process is for law enforcement technology. And so the $5 million need that exists citywide for radios, we're asking for, and I'm sorry, I do have the numbers for these. I should have told you those numbers, but for the radios, we're looking at $1.5 million to meet just the law enforcement component of the need there. On increasing the diversity of police and police pathways, so this is a $2 million request. This, again, was explained to us as building on some existing programs that are done in the police department to give people who are interested in a law enforcement career opportunities to learn more through paid internships. So they work with Step Up, and then they also have an Explorer program, and that leads into other avenues for those who want to explore this career. So this would be providing more resources to do the same thing, with the goal of really reaching the more diverse people in the community to hopefully see if they can increase the diversity of law enforcement at some point down the line. The next one is school-based clinics. City of Minneapolis supports clinics that are located in some Minneapolis high schools to provide mental health services and as well as some medical services. And right now, there are a few extra staff that are being funded through a federal grant that came through the state to increase a few staff positions in the high school. So I think there's a couple nurses, a medical assistant, and a mental health professional. And so this request would seek to continue those jobs when they end in June. Eliminating home health hazards. So as you may know, the city has a program that works with property owners to come in and work with them to assess lead hazards in the home and then abate those, and to maybe arrange to put that on property taxes to spread out the costs. But there's always there's a gap in that process where there can be a need for capital that is not really being addressed yet. And so the request for this, which is another $2 million request, would support this effort and help fill that gap that can be a barrier to doing the abatement necessary. Final item on this list is ADA pedestrian ramps. I don't know if you guys have been hearing about that one a lot, but the city has a aggressive ADA transition plan where we really need to transform a lot of infrastructure around the city to make sure it's accessible for everyone. And so there's a request here for $3 million towards that effort. So again, what we did before was we took everything that was considered viable, meaning this is ready, seems to fit, and we submitted it into the process. But we'll go through a couple more things here. So, as I mentioned earlier, when we do submit these into the Senate process, we do need to rank them. And I think that the ranking has limited value at the end of the day because this whole thing is such a puzzle in terms of determining which things are going to get to the finish line and which things are ultimately competitive. We're still almost in an iterative process with everybody. And we are working very closely with Senator Smith and Klobuchar and with Representative Omar's office. So we don't necessarily think that what we put into that system is that critical, but we do want to be transparent with you about that, and we'll explain what we're proposing to do with that. So in order to really determine if we need to put a ranking on these, and what can we tell about them and how we should potentially rank them. So we had discussions with our federal lobbyists, and we talked to staff for our federal delegation. And in those conversations, we really got a lot of insight into the technical viability of these in terms of which of these are really a good fit for this process, a good fit for the fund that's available, and are they competitive within that fund? So we took in a lot of that input to try to inform, how we might express our priorities. So I'll start with the fact that, I think we found it helpful last year that we really just kind of identified a few top priority projects and then gave some of the extra attention to those projects. So based on the feedback we have received throughout this entire process and the technical criteria required, we're suggesting that IGR really put a lot of extra focus on these 3 projects. Again, 38th Street, that is one that, because it was on our list last year, we've had extensive conversations with our members, and they very much encouraged us that should be a high priority and that they're very supportive. Tech pathways, I think in general, people were very interested in providing something, opportunities for our youth, and workforce development in its own category is also something people value. So this seemed like a good project. And with both of these projects, another element of their ranking highly for us is that they're going to go to an account where they're seen as very competitive in that account. And similar types of projects have been funded in those accounts, so it gives us some reason to believe that these have a chance. And the final one we would prioritize, again, is the Plymouth Avenue Apartments. We got a lot of feedback that people really wanted an affordable housing related proposal. And we have one. So, and of course, I mean, the fact that WDOG was funded last year is evidence that it's a competitive type of project to bring. And then, before I go to questions, okay, so I discussed this topic of like needing to put a ranking on projects for the Senate process. Again, I really think that it's got a limited amount of weight, really, as far as what the value of putting that ranking is. But what we would propose to do is put them in this order. And this order represents that, mostly that technical viability was a huge factor here. Like, are these a good fit for this process was a huge factor here. But then the stuff that rose to the top is stuff that is a good fit for the process and is also something that we really heard from our delegation, matches their interests and priorities very well. So that's kind of why some things rose to the top. Some of the things that were landed towards the bottom are ones that we got some feedback that they were really great potentially, but that it wasn't clear if they were a good match for an earmark. And like, for example, I'll talk about school-based clinics, because that one was something that I really love and would, really wished could be at the top of the list. But we got some pretty direct feedback that there's a couple reasons why that one's actually not good for an earmark. And the feedback was that there are basically other funding streams that Congress might see as available already for this type of thing. And with the earmark, they might trying to look for projects maybe that don't fit an available funding stream. And in fact, like, that reasoning actually factors into why the three that are at the bottom, is that they're seen as things that have different funding potentially available, so it's unclear if they would be competitive. Another thing that we heard about school-based clinics, for example, is that funds jobs. It's specifically funding staff positions. And there's some reluctance from our members to fund jobs, because in a couple years, people will lose those jobs. So there's, this is some of the factors that went into this. The police requests are kind of in the middle here. St. Paul had requests through this process last year that basically are very similar to these, and therefore we do know that they are competitive projects and technically viable projects. So again, and then the stuff on the top was things that we thought were technically viable and reflected the most what we heard from our members in terms of priorities. So with the alternative 911 response, we did hear an interest in public safety issues, but especially if it could be, maybe supporting some of the alternatives to traditional policing, and that's where that one fits in. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. I'd like to recognize President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair. I think Councilmember Wansley Wollabar may have been first in queue.
I apologize, I didn't see your.
No
Go
problem.
ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair Rainville, and thank you, Council President Jenkins. I just had a quick question in terms of the process of determining viable projects. You mentioned in one of these slides that primacy strategy group. Just interested in kind of their role in helping us assess viable projects.
Yeah, so their role there was to really help on the side of the equation where we were trying to determine, does this match the earmark process in general? Again, is there an account that is a match for this? Kind of the appropriateness of the request for that process. So they didn't really have, the ability to weigh in on the other question that we were asking IGR, and we were discussing with each department, which is kind of like, is this ready to go? Is it ready to go right now? Can you deal with this process? That was not where primacy strategy group primarily was involved. It was more like, again, kind of looking at the technical viability of each of these projects to actually be successful in a process like this.
Thank you for that. And just a follow-up question, do we work with them to kind of assess a lot of our kind of, lobbying efforts, be it federally, and especially going after some of this competitive funding?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Wansley Warlaba. I mean, we work very closely with Primacy Strategy Group as our federal lobbying team on anything where we do kind of need to assess something or understand a federal funding opportunity. And I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but we work extensively with them when it comes to understanding federal programs. Yeah.
Thank you, Council President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Rainville. And, I'm thrilled that the 38th Street United CDC is still at the top of our list, and that our federal representatives are interested in this. I think this project could potentially, this funding could potentially, revitalize East 38th Street, but more importantly, really help us to identify what is the appropriate level of memorial at 38th in Chicago, or George Floyd Square, as it were. And I want to thank CPED and others for helping to develop this proposal. And also just really thank the IGR team for their committed and dedicated work, particularly in these hostile environments like our state legislature, as well as at the federal level. We know that things are really divided, and you guys continue to work full-throated in trying to bring resources and positive outcomes to the city of Minneapolis. So thank you to the IGR team led by Director Moore, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Madam President. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Are there any further questions or discussions? Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Rainville. Ms. Olson, just quick question. Could you just list through the fund?
The numbers?
Yeah, that
Yes,
would be
I
great.
can, and
Thank you.
yeah, that would have been a nice thing to include on the slide, right? So 38th Street is a $2 million request. Tech Pathways is $500,000. Plymouth Avenue Apartments is a $2 million request. The alternative 911 response is I think 1.5 million, I believe. Replacement radios is $2 million. The police pathways is a $2 million request. School-based clinics is a $1 million request. Lead and health hazards is $2 million, and the ADA ped ramps is a $3 million request. The first one was 38th Street United CDC. That's a $2 million ask.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other further questions? Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to echo some of the sentiments that I heard from the council president. Got a chance to see our IGR team firsthand working in DC and talking to our legislative, our federal partners there. And the advocacy is tremendous, and I think that the work is really good. And I'm excited to see this list, and I'm excited to see, we sat in meetings where, folks were encouraging us to take on, some of the policing things that we see on this list. And I got to see the team saying, yeah, we also want to make sure that we're asking for things like these alternatives, like the nature code project and stuff like that. So just want to thank you all, Director Moore, Lauren Olson. Thank you guys so much for your advocacy and all the work that you do. And I have no doubt that whether it's issues like the issues that my colleague, Councilmember Goodman, brought up, that you guys are the team that we can really rely on. So to handle those things and to lean in and to do that due diligence. So thanks again, and that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. And Councilmember Chavez.
Yeah, I'll make it quickly. One, thank you all for the work that you all do. I know it is not easy work, and it's very much appreciated here on the council. Wanted to highlight the 38th Street and how much change that could bring to both the council president and in my ward, and the difference it can make in the George Floyd Square area, and how much work that you all do is very much appreciated. And knowing that our city's taking accessibility very seriously, adding this on the ADA pedestrian ramp is very important too. So thank you all for the work that you're doing, and it's very much appreciated here on the council.
Thank you.
Seeing no further discussion, I'll direct the clerk to file that report. And with that, we've concluded all our business to come before the committee today. And hearing no objection, I will declare this meeting adjourned. And I appreciate my colleagues' patience with me, as this is my first chair. And I stumbled a little, but thank you for sticking with me. Thank you.